My name is Micheline Maylor, and I'm a poet, a poetry fanatic, and the current poet laureate of Calgary. I somehow make a living out of poetry, which is as rare as bluebirds in winter. I fell in love with the art of it in grade 5 after reading Shel Silverstein's Sick, which you may remember begins with the lines, "I cannot go to school today," said little Peggy Ann McKay. "I have the measles and the mumps, a gash, a rash, the purple bumps. My mouth is wet, my throat is dry. I'm going blind in my right eye. My tonsils are as big as rocks, and I've counted 16 chicken pox. And that's one more, that's 17, and don't you think my face looks green?" And so it goes until the end lines. "What's that? What's that you say? You say today is Saturday? Goodbye, I'm going out to play." It was the first time that I was struck by words as art. For others, this rapture takes a long time later. Just about 2 years ago, I had a student named Tony who wanted to know, why is poetry art? Art is a very old word. Its etymology extends back to the 10th century. Its meaning is closely connected with skill, craft, or human handicraft. Tony thought of art as visual, let's say paintings hanging in a gallery or sculpture, not so much as literary art. Yet poetry is the most ubiquitous and accessible of the arts, present in every culture and every form of writing. It is the most convenient art, needing neither easel nor special equipment. It requires only language, a recording device, a pen, a phone, a scrap of paper, an image, or a line. And as literary art, poetry is the most versatile genre. Many times my students have written poems on their phones, on the bus, on napkins, on scraps of paper, and occasionally even their arms in a flurry of inspiration. Poetry is a term as wide and variable as the term music. Poetry contains subgenres such as lyric narrative, experimental, concrete, spoken word, performance, formally structured, and prose poems. Like the word music, poetry's subgenres emerged at the start of the 20th century. New expressions in poetry moved from traditional Victorian poetry with its long lines and perfect rhyme and changed to many other forms. Spoken word with its roots in the Harlem Renaissance, free verse, all the way up to the experimental poets such as contemporary author Christian Book and his scientific genome poem. Poetry is a large art form, which led Tony to the next questions. What is it good for? Why should I take a poetry class or even read poetry if it won't help me find a career? Retired professor and poet Tom Wayman argues that poetry lives outside of the money economy and therefore acts as a medium for social change. I would also argue as personal change. So if poetry is not going to increase the GNP or improve Alberta's economy or even change the unemployment situation, then what is its value? I have observed that poetry is the great connector because of what it does. Poetry makes our lives bigger through its expansiveness. It makes our lives richer, wider, and more layered by the ways in which it gives us an aesthetic frisson. These frissons often show up as, aha, or I wished I'd written that, or yes, I feel that too. A poetic moment happens in many ways. For example, in the movie Ratatouille, food critic Anton Ego sits down to a meal prepared by Remy. And as Ego puts the food in his mouth, he's transported back to a time when he felt and lived love. As the meal continues, he returns to his place in the restaurant and proceeds to write an extraordinary review because of his own internal connections. And that is what poetry is, an internal communion, sometimes labeled as gestalt. Poetry is a mystical connection to what we feel and experience as profound aesthetic arrest. Poetry's magic is universal. In all times and in all cultures, poetry exists because of the way it is connecting the unsayableness of human emotion to language. Poet Charles Simic says, "The highest levels of our own consciousness are wordless." So poetry becomes an expression of our wonderment and the combined craft of making language and expression beautiful and artful. When a poet does his or her job right, a reader feels that aha. When this happens, it is the most valuable social glue that we have. We feel intimate with a larger world and with our own inner lives at the same time. It allows us more understanding and empathy towards our own world and ourselves, because we find words and images for our unsayable feelings. We can rewrite the story of feeling disconnected or lost, and we can redefine ourselves as understood. Tony asked, "So poetry makes us feel that our most profound feelings, truth, beauty, love, sorrow, despair, which are felt as wordless, are being given expression?" "Yes," I said. "In this act, the unsayable becomes said. Really, poetry is an act of magic. Poetry is a type of wisdom. Or as the poet Seamus Heaney says, poetry is divination. It is a revelation of the self to the self. And in this sort of revelation of ourselves to ourselves, we respond to these questions. How do I know and record what I feel? The responses we receive as either readers or writers of the craft contribute to knowing and wisdom." But back to Tony, my computer scientist student. I showed him this poem by Charles Bukowski. Bluebird. "There is a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke, and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess up the works? Do you want to screw me up? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes when everyone's asleep, and I say, I know you're in there, but don't be sad. And then I put him back, but he's singing in there just a little. And I haven't quite let him die, and we sleep together like that in our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep, but I don't weep. Do you?" And after that, Tony said, "Aha! I feel like that too. I feel like I have a bluebird in my heart too." And I watched him connect his head to his heart. And then, just then, he switched his major to English Lit. But please, please don't tell his mom about the rarity of winter bluebirds, because poetry is for everyone.